I'm Matt Guichard, and this is No Holds Barred. In this episode, I want to talk about domestic violence. So what is domestic violence? Well, I think we can all kind of figure out that domestic violence means something where people live together, their husband and wife, their spouse, and somebody beats up somebody. There was a time not too long ago in California where the police showed up at a house, and let's say the husband is punched the wife and she's got a big shiner, and the officer would say to the wife, "Okay, do you want to make a citizen's arrest?" And what do you think happened in many of those cases? The wife goes, "Oh, no. Why? She was terrified of him. He had beaten her before, or he was the total sugar daddy. He made all the money, and they needed his money. They needed him at home. A million reasons why they did not want to go forward, at least in front of the husband, make that citizen's arrest. The law is completely different now. Police show up, somebody's got bumps and bruises. Guess what? Somebody's going to jail. And sometimes when both living together or both have bumps and bruises or scars or blood, they're both going. Police are saying, don't put me in the middle of this. I will go back and say, when I was a prosecutor, we would charge cases where the spouse, and in most cases the wife, had said, yeah, I want to make a citizen's arrest. And then we'd charge it, we get ready for trial, and the wife would go, oh boy, second thoughts. Maybe the husband threatened her. And again, we go back to this idea, what is society trying to do? They're trying to keep families together. So the idea was, we don't want to put people in a position where one is charging another, and it ruins marriages, it ruins families. So we try to, the benefit was worse than what actually happened, because abuse was rampant. And now we have many more statutes. In fact, too many to even include in this episode. But I want to talk about Penal Code Section 243E1. When a battery is committed against a spouse, a person with whom the defendant is cohabitating, a person who is the parent of the defendant's child, a former spouse, a fiancé or a fiancée, or a person with whom the defendant currently or previously had a dating or engagement relationship. So when a battery, what's a battery? It's an offensive touching. It's a punch, a poke, or whatever. So it's a battery against. Now, it's not just a spouse. So the statute takes in, if you're living with somebody, you're cohabitating, the person is the parent of a child. You're not married, never been married, but you've co-parented a child. It's a former spouse. You're divorced. You're going to get married as fiancé or fiancée, a male or a female. Okay, you're getting ready. You're engaged. You currently or previously had a dating relationship. You don't even have it anymore, but you had a dating relationship or an engagement relationship previously. So the statute now is to say, well, wait a minute, we're not just going to say it's not a crime if somebody beats up an old girlfriend because it's an old girlfriend. No, we're going to say if there are relationships that we can put together and that person is battered, it's domestic violence, and it falls within the statute. 243D of the Penal Code. Remember, the other one was 243E1. So if you want to look up these statutes, go to the Penal Code and look in the 243, 242 sections, battery and on. 243D, when a battery is committed against any person and serious bodily injury is inflicted on the person, it's a felony. So 243 involves anything. So you go out and serious bodily injury to a stranger, or, guess what, in this case, to a spouse, somebody you cohabitate, a former girlfriend, a former boyfriend, anything such as that, it is a felony if it's serious bodily injury. So that's something that we show up, or the police show up at a house right away. Somebody's seriously injured. Boy, they've been stabbed. They've been beaten up so much their jaw is broken. That's serious bodily. That is a felony. And off they go. And society does not countenance that kind of activity. And it's important that we understand that, and that it's important that batterers understand that. So Penal Code section up in the 270s, 273.5 is willful infliction of corporal injury, which is a felony. So you purposefully try to injure somebody. That's another statute. And then one that people often talk about under domestic violence is Penal Code section 13700B. Domestic violence means abuse committed against an adult or a minor who is a spouse, a former spouse, a cohabitant, a former cohabitant, or person with whom the suspect has had a child or is having or has had a dating or engagement relationship. So kind of similar to 243E1, but not exactly the same. What these are tools for the police, for society, for a district attorney's office to use in prosecuting or examining domestic violence. So we hear of it so often, and I'll go back to that first story where a woman is terrified. I was at trial one time, starting a trial in a domestic violence case. It was a misdemeanor. The spouse, the female, was reluctant, but had then gone ahead with the police and made a citizen's arrest. The husband and wife were still living together at the time of trial, and the woman came to me and said, I want to drop all charges. I just want you to dismiss. And you know what I did? I said, not on your life. Literally, not on your life is what I said. I said, because we're going to find you on a ditch. This has happened before. I appreciate that you're frightened. I appreciate. So what we're going to do is go in front of the judge. I am not going to dismiss the case. I'm not going to have your death or your injury on my conscience. And legally, this has been charged, and I see no reason why it should be dismissed, because I believe it happened. I believe there's no excuse for it. But if you want to go in front of the judge and advocate that you don't want to testify and you won't testify, and the judge dismisses the case, that's up to the judge, but that's not up to me. I will say in the last few years, Contra Costa County has had a zero tolerance for domestic violence. And in many cases in which a spouse or cohabitant or whomever, a victim has said, I don't want to go forward, those cases have continued and gone to trial. And I do appreciate it. I've looked at the statistics. There's probably a 50% rate of conviction. So lots of effort, lots of time, lots of energy, lots of cost has gone into those trials. And it looks like somewhere in the neighborhood of only 50% of those trials have resulted in a conviction because the victim is reluctant to go forward for a number of reasons. And in my view, in most cases, it is fear. So how do we correct that? What do we want to do? Well, in many cases, the spouse who's being abused can get a restraining order. And people say, well, yeah, except a restraining order is a piece of paper. And if somebody wants to abuse, they will abuse no matter what. And I say, well, perhaps that's correct. But at least it is an intervention. It is a tool by which somebody can get a restraining order, restraining the person. And in that situation, you might remember from a prior No Holds Barred where we talked about restraining orders. We talked about that kind of thing where the person cannot possess any weapons, got to sell them. You can't just give them to your brother-in-law. There are a number of things that you can't do that impact you, It goes on your rap sheet. There are a number of reasons why, in my view, a restraining order is not something a person wants to have against them. And for most people, that restraining order, that restrained person will comply with it. We hear every once in a while it just doesn't matter. Somebody is not going to pay the least bit of attention, but it is a tool. And if there is a restraining order in place, what should happen is once a person gets that restraining order, they should then go register it with the local police agency where they live. If it's a different jurisdiction where they work, take it to that jurisdiction. Make sure that any and all police agencies, wherever they are, where their kids are, have that. So that when something happens, they're calling the police and saying, I have somebody at my house who is a restrained person. They're not supposed to be here. They've been calling me on the phone. Here's evidence. Here's the messages. Here's the restraining order. The police respond, and they know. In that case, they can take the person into custody, and it is a violation of the law. It's a misdemeanor, typically, to violate that restraining order. So very important. But getting back to the concept of domestic violence and all these statutes, all these reasons why we have them is because it's huge. It's a huge problem in our society. And we know oftentimes there are drug and alcohol abuse, problems with domestic violence. I'm talking about the child abuse. We had a prior podcast having to do with child abuse. And so often it is kind of a crossover, domestic abuse, child abuse, all part of the same thing, all subject to the same problems and the same tools that society can use to attempt to get to that problem. So in many cases, police agencies are mandated to go through training, how to deal with domestic violence, how to deal with child protective services. We have those agencies. We have agencies to help spouses, domestic people who have been abused, to have children abused, social services. Lots and lots of societies' efforts are going into this huge problem of domestic violence. And I often say to people, if you have a temper, let's get you into an anger management class. If you have an alcohol problem, let's get you into an alcohol abuse class. If you have a drug problem, let's get you into that. Let's get people dealing with the underlying problems. But nevertheless, there is no excuse for people not acting. There's no excuse for these issues. So what do we have? Going back to restraining orders, going back to treatment, and ultimately the sanction of being convicted and sent to prison. And that is what can happen. What can happen. Now, too often we hear recently of some shooting somewhere, and what did it result from? Well, spouses got divorced. Husband has expressed some violent thoughts. There's a restraining order against the husband. When there's a restraining order in the state of California, that husband cannot purchase a weapon and cannot possess a weapon. So let's jump to the United States Supreme Court. Heard argument, I believe, this week on the very issue. I believe the man was named Rahimi. Domestic violence restraining order against him. Is it a Second Amendment violation to deny him the right to have a gun? And honestly, that was heard. And it appears, although the court has not ruled, that the justices are not in favor of Mr. Rahimi possessing a weapon, because the discussion is that he was a dangerous person. He used a weapon and threatened a spouse, and he certainly should not be allowed under the Second Amendment to have a weapon. But we hear that. People have them. Sometimes, as I said before, a restraining order is simply a piece of paper, and there are certain people that aren't going to pay attention. But those people should not have the ability to possess a firearm. and there should be the greatest sanctions against them if in fact they do, and they use that against a spouse or a cohabitant or whomever. So that's all I want to talk about domestic violence today, but I want to raise that awareness. I want to raise that issue. If you are a victim of domestic violence, or you know of somebody, get help for them, and certainly assist them with restraining orders. At the court in Martinez and in most courthouses, there is a desk you can go to and you can have a discussion about how do you go about the process of obtaining a restraining order in a domestic violence situation, and they'll just walk you through it. You get what's called a temporary restraining order if you meet the that burden. It's not a high burden, but it's a burden, and then there'll be a hearing, and I absolutely suggest that people get an attorney for that, although many of those hearings are improper. But get a lawyer to assist in that process of obtaining that restraining order. I call it a personal conduct order that makes somebody don't call, don't harass, don't beat, don't have a friend do it, all the various things that a restraining order is designed to do. They oftentimes last generally 3 years, sometimes as little as 1 year, but 3 years, 5 years, some. And more recently, I heard about a lifetime restraining order against somebody. And a lifetime restraining order means they cannot possess a weapon ever. Ever. So very important, domestic violence in our society, how we overcome it. Here's some of the tools, and here's the law to let you know. If you have any questions at all about this, put it in the chat, all right? And if you like this episode, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We look forward to hearing from you.